Our media specialist, Ryan Evans, are here to help us out for the presentation. And as part of our monthly meeting here, we'll be taking a brief look on current USDA-National cash rental rates and also outlook somewhat on farm policy, farm program payments. Allan will be taking a look at some of the things related to leases. What do we need to be doing in the off season? And then we had several questions submitted before our presentation today that we had some time to prepare the questions on. So thank you for joining us, and we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, I'm Jim Jansen. I'm on the left-hand side of this slide. If you have any questions for myself or Allan Vyhnalek on the right-hand side, please feel free to reach out to us. You can reach us either via email or phone, and we'll be more happy to get back to you. In the month of December, we'll be on the road quite a bit, so just give us some time, but we'll try to get back to you when we can. And something new that we're doing as part of Land Management Quarterly, we're having people help sponsor these meetings to help defray some of the costs of doing our annual land survey related to the land values and cash rental rates that are featured throughout the year as part of it. Today, we have Hertz Farm Management out of Norfolk, Nebraska. We got Scott, David, and Jason. They do different things related to farmland management, farm real estate sales. They also have appraisals available. Feel free to reach out to them if you need anything, and we greatly thank them for their support of this presentation today. Briefly, as I just described, our outline for our presentation today, we'll be taking a look at where the 2022 cash rental rates are at from the USDA that were published in early September of 2022. Also, I'll be taking a look briefly at ARC and PLC payments. Where are they at? Where we might be headed in the future? Allan will be kind of taking a look at what do we need to be thinking about in the off season. Just because farmers aren't busy out in the fields, you still have things, regardless if you're a landlord or a tenant, to be discussing beyond the 2023 cash rental rates. So we'll be taking a look at that. And then finally, to wrap everything up, we'll be taking a look at some of the things that we have related to land management questions. We had some really good ones submitted this time. So briefly here on the USDA cash rental rates for 2022, as part of our survey work, we also like to feature other institutions or other resources that we find. And the USDA does an excellent survey at the county level. So briefly, where can you find this information? Well, for one thing, all my slides today, along with Allan's, all of our slides will be posted online. And inside our slides, you'll be able to find the link that you can click on, which is featured on the bottom portion of the slide here today. And with that, the USDA, they do a county level cash rent survey. The results typically are published in early September, usually around kind of the second Friday in September is where we tend to see the actual maps that we'll be featuring that are pushed out online. And with their information, it's free and open to the public. Anyone can find it. And they do cash rental rates surveys on irrigated and dry land cropland, in addition to grazing land on a per acre basis. So one thing I know many folks are going to be looking or talking, if you haven't already, about 2023 cash rental rates. But on the topic of 2022, sometimes you have to take a step back and look where you've been. How do your averages that you're currently paying, how do they stack up against the county or the regional averages the University of Nebraska puts out? The reason I ask that question is depending on how they stack up, how they compare. If you're already on the upper end of the upper end, I don't know if you're going to see a lot of increase, especially with some of the concerns we have related to the major inputs for seed, fertilizer, and chemicals. If you're somewhere else, we'll see what the negotiations lead to. But as always, you have to account for the quality of your land, rainfall, whatever. Here for 2022, the USDA, and once again, I featured the link on the bottom of this slide. If you type it in, you can find it on your own. The USDA does a county level cash rent survey. You see that the higher cash rental rates tend to be in the eastern third of Nebraska, especially kind of in the east and northeast regions of the eastern third. You'll also notice an example for dryland cropland here in the Sandhills, the strip of counties that kind of make up the heart of the Sandhills. You don't see any dryland cash rental rates. Well, obviously, if you're in the Sandhills, the amount of cropland, row crop or small grain ground might be fairly limited. And with that being said, they don't get enough responses that they can produce a number with confidence. Also in pockets of western Nebraska here, if they didn't get enough responses, that's why we see the white counties. Moving over to the irrigated cash rental rates. One thing to note with the USDA on their irrigated cash rental rates, they do not divide out the center pivot from the gravity or flood irrigated rates. So if you're in some of these counties here where they have a fairly, still a fair amount of gravity or flood irrigation occurring, you'll see here along Interstate 80, for example, in Hull or Buffalo counties. In these counties, what we see here is they create somewhat of a weighted average, an average that accounts for the center pivot in addition to the gravity or flood irrigated rates. So an example of Buffalo County, just making up an example here, if a third of the acres in the county are flood or gravity irrigated and another 2/3 are center pivot, the weighted average they come up with is what's being reflected here. Also, you'll notice counties in the southeast, for example, there may not be very much irrigation in some of these areas. And that's some of the reasons why we see some of the counties in white. Lancaster, there is some, but there may not be quite as much gravity irrigation, or excuse me, as much irrigation in Lancaster County relative to surrounding counties. Finally, on the USDA cash rental rates, you'll see that several of these counties are in white. So an example in Merritt County, which is predominantly row crop country, there is some grazing land, but fairly limited compared to other areas. The counties, once again, are in white. Same thing in Douglas and Sarpy. Obviously, if you're in the metro areas would not be having nearly as much grazing land. These rates are for the traditional summer grazing season. So if you're in some of these areas where you do fall, winter, early spring during calving, something like that, you may adjust those rates to account for some of the differences in the quality of forage or availability, things of that nature. And these are on a per acre basis. And once again, we tend to see some of the higher rates. An example, Wayne County came in at $88.50 versus Scottsbluff County, you were talking at $13.50, for example. So it just depends where you're at relative to the stocking rate, how many acres it takes for one cow-calf pair or one stocker calf, whatever you're running. Okay, we'll switch over here. So we briefly took a look at the USDA cash rental rates. These slides will be posted online. Our media specialist, Ryan Evans, will be sending this information out after this presentation's over. Please keep in mind, if you can find this slide, you can either find the information that way or on the bottom of this slide where you have this being presented right here. You can also take a look at that information. All right, so I'll be switching over here. The second thing I wanted to feature today, we took a look at some of the USDA information related to cash rental rates. This time of the year, if you're participating in different Farm Service Agency or FSA programs, some of these you may have heard of before, ARC, Ag Risk Coverage, or PLC, Price Loss Coverage. With these programs, we can take a look at what are the projections on them. And Brad Lubin is our farm policy specialist here in the Department of Agricultural Economics here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And as part of his work, he recently did a webinar in partnership with the University of Missouri with Rural and Farm Finance Policy Analysis Center. And with their work, what they did was the presentation is available online, and I note the link on the bottom of this slide. But as part of their presentation, they took an outlook on where is farm income, expenses, farm policy, farm program projections, where are all these things headed? And from these slides, I wanted to pull out about 5 or 6 that I feel are very important, regardless if you're a landlord or a tenant, things that we need to be aware of or cognitive of when it comes to negotiating cash rents. So once again, if you'd like to watch this entire webinar, the excerpt that I took from it are what I'll be referring to in the next series of slides here. But please take a look at the CAP website here. And all of our webinars are given on Thursday at midday from 12 to 1. Wide variety of topics you can find on there. I've given some, Allan has as well, Brad Lubin, some people from outside the university as well. It just depends on the topic of the week. Okay, so just briefly, this presentation was just not a farm income outlook, but more so an ag outlook, policy outlook. What's happening? Obviously, there's a lot of things that are happening in Washington, D.C. One of those big things for landowners across the state of Nebraska or people renting land is, what's the 2023 Farm Bill going to look like? We're also dealing with a period of time right now where drought is quite intense, and with it, quite intense drought, we have a lot of concerns. There have been different programs, when we call them ad hoc. These are programs that are passed via legislation that are not directly tied to the 2023 Farm Bill, but to address, an example, the severe drought that the western half of the United States had. There were different emergency disaster payments to help offset some of the losses that operators incurred as part of that. So obviously there's crop insurance is the cornerstone of our risk management. Some of the farm programs help us enhance our ability to manage that. And some of the other things related to policy that we may not directly think of, but definitely do influence us as operators. Some of the things related to government spending and taxation. There's also been renewed interest in some of these things related to the climate, conservation, potential regulations, whatever that might lead to. Immigration, food policy, markets, and trade are always important. So a lot of these things we have to be aware of, even if we aren't thinking of them day to day. Okay. And one thing that caught my attention when I was going through the slides are some of the farm input expenses. And Brad, on some of the work that he cited here on this slide, one thing that really stood out to me, usually Allan and I talk about the big three for crop and production: seed, fertilizer, and chemicals. And then in the case if you're an irrigator or someone in the agribusiness industry using a lot of electricity, power is also a concern. And one thing that started roughly when COVID started, and it has just taken off since then, are different types of fertilizer. And the fertilizer expenses for the entire state of Nebraska have, they're approaching a very large number, right? These numbers are in the millions. But fertilizer prices have peaked. If they haven't peaked, maybe they're close to it. Whether they're on which side of that peak, I'm not exactly sure, but they're quite high. And also fuel costs, availability of diesel. Can you get diesel when you need it? Should we be prepaying for our energy expenses this upcoming year or not? Electricity prices, they seem to just kind of gradually trend up over time, but these are the big two that we're dealing with. And then when we get to Allan's slides, he'll be talking about communication. But one of the things we need to be, as an operator or as a prudent landowner that's negotiating cash rent, how do we account for these input? Yes, we might be getting pretty good corn, soybean, wheat, whatever prices. But how much is it costing to raise these things? What are our actual crop yields given drought? Yes, crop insurance helps offset some of those losses, but it never completely covers every dollar that you have invested. So we need to be talking about how do we deal with these things. The other thing, this takes a kind of a historic look at the different farm program support that have been paid out over time. Brad noted, and I think I cut part of this slide off just because availability of my slide. But when we look at farm program support, conservation is in green. Conservation would relate to things like CRP, EQIP, some of these things. That's been fairly constant over time. You see that little green bubble there. This pink line, on this bar chart here, that has to do with the disaster payments, the ad hoc disaster payments. And then the crop programs, the ARC and PLC, those are the yellow bars. What do we see on here? Well, in recent years, because some of the declines in yields, forage availability, a lot of this ad hoc payments have really been quite high, especially with some of the disruption in trade we had for operators trying to market their grain. And ad hoc payments are probably going to be trailing off into the future. And it doesn't look like, assuming we had ARC and PLC the way it's designed currently carrying forward into the future, it doesn't look like we're going to be seeing a lot of support from those programs until after the passage of the next farm program. The other thing, Brad, he'll go into more detail if you'd like to actually review this recording. He had a lot of information covered in his presentation. As I referenced before, the majority of farms, if you're participating in the Farm Service Agency, you're either participating in the price loss coverage, the PLC. It's a price support program. So relative to the marketing year average price, the marketing year average price, the overall average drops below the guarantee, you'd receive a payment. Well, if you're looking on this slide right here, all these numbers are in zero. referring to that the marketing year average price, while it hasn't been set yet, is trending a lot higher than some of the guarantees that we see. The other thing on the ARC program, the majority of farms are taking ag risk coverage at the county level. With ag risk coverage, or the ARC program at the county level, you have to have a substantial drop in revenue relative to where some of these projected marketing year average prices are. That's what's highlighted in the second box. It's not to say it's going to be impossible for counties to trigger ARC county, but given current prices and yield declines, yes, we've had substantial yield declines because of the drought. But you got to remember, revenue is composed of just not yield, but yield and price. So we have to think about those things. And I would say if we do see any ARC trigger, it's going to have to be fairly substantial drops at the county level. Probably not going to be on the irrigated side. It may be on the county dry land if there's separate guarantees for your irrigated and dry land cropping practices. And the final piece here, trying to kind of set the stage for Allan when we're looking at the outlook for 2023. What are things going to look like? Brad, in this slide, what he did here, USDA puts out different price projections periodically, and there is also other groups, the FAPRI, the Food and Agricultural Policy Research Institute. They also do projections. Well, with all these different things, the one point Brad wanted to make was, while we can make a projection, we truly don't know what is going to happen to prices. And that's why I highlighted in this red box right here. I would assume, especially if we get plentiful rain across the Corn Belt, that we might see prices declining somewhat in the future. But it's a really big guess where prices are headed based on some of these projections. Are we going to have record prices again this year? Who knows? I would anticipate we might see things maybe getting into the $5 range on corn, maybe even the high fours, but who knows? So with that, that was a brief review on the farm policy, farm program outlook. With this slide here, we'll go ahead and get switched over to Allan. And to hit the next slide, just pull the little wheel down.
Can I just left click or no?
It's not working.
All right, it's not working. Okay, there we go. Well, I can use it earlier. Hi, glad to be with you again today. I'm going to visit with you about a few topics that kind of come up this time of year and talk about how we're going to close out the year and what things we're going to review. So we need to have good communication. I think I always talk about that. And that is, we have to listen to each other. What are the concerns of the landlords and what are the concerns of the tenants? I think we really have to know that. But it's also a good time to get out to see the farm. If we have to look at where we're at with erosion. However, in many places it didn't rain a lot this year, so you don't have a lot of erosion to deal with. But if you have some ditches or some things like that to get fixed, start talking about that. And for instance, in the ditch that I have in the slide here, not only should you get that kind of filled in and covered up and useful again, you get that ground useful, but you have to look at the top of the hill there above where that ditch started. What can we do up there? In some cases, like on my farm, I'll put in a parallel terrace with a tile drain to try and hold that water from heading down that hill into that ditch, and that's been fairly successful in that situation. So please look at that and know what you want to do with that and try to manage that instead of just letting it reappear every year. Also, did you have any weed pressure out there? It's getting a little late to try and do any spraying, but like this week's going to be warmer again. So maybe possibly people get out and do some fall control of some weeds. You have henbit in the fall that starts as a rosette. For instance, in pastures, it's a great time to go out and treat some of those pastures for thistles, bust thistle rosettes, those kind of things. So don't just let that go because it's going to get warmer again this week and you might have a chance to get that done. So the other thing that kind of comes up in the fall is people want to know how to set their leases for 23, and I have a slide on that here in a minute. But how is yield information shared so you can set a good lease for next year? How is yield information shared so you can finish this year's lease? I think that's important. And so on crop share leases, do we have proper information? Are we getting that sort of thing? And what makes me nervous is when I get the call from the landlord that the tenant has just sent them a check. no record of total bushels, no record of what the prices were. They just send them a check for their crop share. I think we have to have more detail than that. And I think it's important that be fleshed out better. But obviously, the better thing is to haul the crop to some place like an elevator of some sort, somewhere where they buys the crop, so you can get that proper split made. And landlord could sell their own bushels. And then what about cash leases? Then we got to make sure the cash lease is paid. It's a good time to get that done. Can the landowner ask for this yield information? Sure. As a matter of fact, I put requesting crop insurance records for yields I would put that in my lease if I needed to, and I wouldn't be afraid to do it either. And I think that the most important thing about that information, and even yield monitor data from the combine, is I think that the landlord and tenant have to understand this is somewhat of a doctor-patient relationship. In other words, you don't use that yield information as a landlord to go find the next tenant. I think that that's something, it's a private deal between the two parties. And I think you just have to kind of let that go. You have to let that be as internal communication between the two of you. You do not share that with the rest of the world. Please be careful about that. Other things that kind of come up this time of year is what's happening with corn stalks. Who gets to use the corn stalks? Under a crop share, they're shared. Under a cash lease, they belong to the tenant unless they're held out of the lease. And is there any concerns or any charges for using corn stalks? Man, it depends on who's doing the labor. If the tenant's doing all the labor on putting up all the fence, putting up water, putting up minerals, all that sort of thing, and hauling all the water, bringing in, checking the cattle every day, all that sort of thing. If the landlord or that party, the people that own the land or that own the lease are doing nothing, then I'm not sure I charge very much, or it's a very minimal charge. However, in some cases, you can still have some fence up around the landlord's home place, and the landlord's willing to look at the cattle. He's willing to provide water in his yard. He's willing to make sure the cattle are in every day, let the tenant know what's going on. Then, of course, we should be charging for that service. And as long as the stalks aren't completely overgrazed, I think that grazing stocks is a terrific way to get that the corn ears picked up, so that the volunteer corn doesn't come back and be a problem as a weed in soybean the next year, assuming a rotation. The other thing I want to talk about briefly is corn stalks. That's the other way we're putting up corn residue through the cows, or right through corn stalks. Corn stalks are really a valuable product because they contain a lot of husks and a lot of leaves and some cobs and the really higher protein materials that the cows can utilize very, very effectively, especially if you add in a protein source like ground alfalfa or higher energy feed like some silage or even ethanol byproduct feed. It's an excellent way to handle cattle, and of course used for bedding too. The main thing I would be careful of there is just don't rake or process that material too effectively. Leave some residue on the ground. Don't just pull it off clean. I think that's what we have to be careful of. And the other thing I would say about that quickly is that corn stalks should not be harvested off the same field every year. Go to different places and get your corn stalks so that you're not pulling on that organic matter so hard. You're not pulling that phosphorus off so hard, because your corn stalk residue is a good source of organic matter for the soil. It's a good source of phosphorus for the soil as it decomposes. So be careful about using the same field to get your corn stalks off of every year. That's my caution there. And if anybody's got questions about that, throw it in the chat or the Q&A. Hunting season is kind of come and gone. I think the last day was probably yesterday, but how was that managed? Who has the hunting rights? And so with farm ground, the hunting rights belong to the tenant. And with pasture, the hunting rights are typically with the landlord, because typically in a pasture, the pasture grazing season is about 5, maybe 6 months, from May 1st to October 1st and November 1st, and the pasture grazing season's over. So therefore, the lease is terminated or ended before hunting season starts. So the hunting provision goes with the land, stays with the landlord. So just understand there's always exceptions to this, year-round pasture leases, that sort of thing. Just make sure that we talk about that sort of thing before it starts to happen, so that somebody's not getting excited about, well, if I pay for a farm and I'm paying a cash lease for farm ground, and my landlord's getting money, and if I want to sublease that hunting ground out, I could do that unless the lease says something different. and I can keep the money too. So just main thing with hunting leases, or it could be any kind of recreational use, horseback riding, ATVs, fishing, anything like that. Main thing make sure you have a good liability coverage on that land as a landowner. So in case there's any liability issues, that you have protection from an insurance standpoint. Also, a quick reminder about manure. This week we'll get a little warmer, so I would imagine we're going to have a lot of manure heading out to the fields. It's still a great product. I just wouldn't take manure every year. I wouldn't take manure. You should be applying manure according to your phosphorus needs and not according to, this is the closest field to my feedlot. We should be willing to truck manure. It's a good product. It's excellent for phosphorus. It has some nitrogen in it, and it also helps organic matter. So be sure that you use manure efficiently, use manure well, but just don't let it be applied to your field every year. Do that according to your phosphorus recommendations. So other considerations for 23. What should happen to cash leases? I just had a phone call about a half hour before this program started from some people in East Central Nebraska that said, what do we do? What should we be doing with our cash lease? Should it be going up or should it be going down? Well, kind of depends on where you're at right now. And it also kind of depends on, I wish people would know, especially for cash leases, they would know what their yield is, because if we could set that lease based on productivity, I think that's a lot more efficient. I think that's a lot better way to do that. And so please be sure to try and get good yield information from your tenant so that you can make a good decision about that. As Jim talked about, there's certainly some uncertainty for crop prices and for the drought going into next year. I've talked to several people, especially out in central and southwest Nebraska, that just flat couldn't get enough water on the corn, and the corn yields were suppressed by a bunch of bushels, 20 to 50 bushels per acre, because they just couldn't get water out there enough. They were running those pivots just pretty much constantly, all the way around, all the time, and they still couldn't get enough water out there. They felt like, and with the diesel prices way up, input costs way up, and Jim talked about fertilizer already, 2.5, 3 times higher than it has been. And now we also have the cost of all the parts. You know, I was just out to the Panhandle 2 weeks ago, and a guy comes up to me and says, "Yeah," and so I have a combine with duals on the drive wheels, and the inside dual had a bubble on it, meaning the sidewalls bursting. So we take those tires apart, and we can't just replace one, because then the one tire would be way taller than the other tire, because these were fairly worn tires. So we had to replace 2. But then when we put those 2 on, realized the combine wasn't sitting anywhere close to level, and that wasn't going to work. So we ended up taking off, and the other 2 were fairly worn anyway. So we ended up taking them off. And then he goes, you know, the biggest problem with all that, I got 4 brand new drive tires on my combine, but they were $2,700 a piece. That's $10,800, as I could tell, plus tax. So if there's tax on tires, I'm not quite sure. There's probably a tax to get rid of the old ones. So just make sure that you understand that expenses are just insane for people trying to raise crops and livestock and all that. The farm input costs are crazy. Prices are good right now, but what about expenses? How will crop prices remain? I can't tell any of those things. As a matter of fact, you know, Jim and I have often joked that if we really knew what was happening with all of this, we wouldn't have to do this job. We could make, you know, some serious money. So what I suggest is push a sharp pencil and evaluate the equitable split. Jim suggests that you do that based on what a what a crop share rent would look like. I think that if you looked at somewhere around 20 or 25%, I'm lowering my number, but you got to look at 20, 25% of the gross income on a per acre basis. And that's about what the landlord should be. That's where about the landlord should be, in my view, right now, because of the increasing expenses and the way crop prices are relatively higher. We have to be a little careful about that. But maybe the most important thing is to sit down between landlord and tenant and figure out the whole budget. And I don't care if it's a cash rent or a crop share, figure out the whole budget, get down to the bottom number. And if there's some money left, how are you going to split that? What's the equitable split for the 2 of you? I think that's the important thing to consider. Again, as always, we have to talk about making sure you have a good written lease. The written leases are critical to make this all work out. I know that people in my age group and older, my parents' generation, felt like our word was our bond and we didn't need a written lease because we trusted each other. And I get that. We do trust each other. The bottom line is what happens when we're not around. What happens when we're gone? I don't tell somebody what my lease provisions are and I don't have a written lease, how's anybody going to know? You know, my most heartbreaking story was to get a call from a lady that said, I am the durable power of attorney for my mother, meaning that she took care of her mother's financial works. Now the mom can no longer answer for herself. And to be true, the mom was in a memory care unit in a nursing home and could no longer answer for herself. She said, how am I going to deal with this lease? I said, well, lady, you get the written lease out and you talk to the tenant about the written lease and come up with a plan for the next year. And she goes, well, that's the problem. There was no written lease. And so that's the importance of a written lease. And by the way, that older generation didn't tend to tell their kids what was in the lease because they felt like, I didn't want to share any of my personal business because my personal business was mine and mine alone. And so I'm not going to tell anybody about that. That's my deal. That's my deal. And I don't share that. That's not important. And so if you don't share the information and it's not written down, then we're putting that next generation in a terrible, uncomfortable spot to have to deal with what happens at least next. And so let's be careful about that. I think so just make sure you have a written lease. That's really important. We can find, if you need to start a written lease, you go to aglease101.org. That's the website. They have free PDF leases in that document library link. The document library link looks something like this. And lease information is on the left, publications about how to set up a lease, those kind of definition stuff's on the left. And on the right is like the second link down is the first link down is a cash farm lease. The second link down is a crop share farm lease. And those are great fill in the blank products for people to use to get their lease put together. So if you got any questions about that, make sure you contact Jim or myself. Either one of us can help you with that sort of thing. And we encourage you to use that to start your written lease. You're not going to use all the provisions listed in this publication, but it gives you a great start to get the right provisions in your lease. Okay, now the question and answer period. Jim, I guess we'll get in here and kind of do this together. You said you had the first ones.
Yeah, so one of the first questions that we had submitted to us is, what is the most common type of crop insurance used across Nebraska or the United States related to the major types of crops that we grow here, common types of row crops, whether corn, soybean, small grains such as wheat or something like that. And it's a really good question. And there's a lot of data out there. And I didn't have quite all the time to take a look at this, but the one thing I did find was the USDA, as I noted here on the bottom of this slide, the Economic Research Service. They actually have a very interesting webpage, and it's called Crop Insurance at a Glance. And on their website, they put together a very simple bar chart. And this started back in the early 90s to about 2020. And I would expect 2022, 2023 is going to be fairly similar to 2020. But with it, what they did was they took a look at the major types of crop insurance that are federally subsidized. And if you see in the pink here, they refer to the one as individual revenue. Individual revenue, so this would be like revenue protection crop insurance. That dominates, especially for the type of crops we grow here in the state of Nebraska. It makes up the most largest share, and followed second by yield protection insurance. Some of these other types of insurance might be utilized a little bit more in some of the east and western region of the United States, where you have some types of specialty crop production. But related to yield protection and revenue protection, depending on where you're at in the state, it seems to be in that 70 to 75% range. Some of the higher risk areas, insurance costs a little bit more, so they might take a little bit less coverage just because of the cost. Some of the more stable areas with respect to the yields, they don't fluctuate quite as well. Maybe they'd step it up to 80. The other thing I'll point out is, depending on who you are, if you're a beginning producer, maybe even if it does cost more per acre, you got to take out 80% because that's where the bank says that you got to be covering your investment. Some of those things also play into that. The other thing, there was another question that came in, and we have featured this slide on prior presentations earlier on in the year. Where do we anticipate the land prices, cash rents, where are they going to be headed? And Allan has made some comments on at least cash rental rates. Two big things that I'm going to be looking at. First big thing is, what about the value of what we're doing? On this slide here, we have the value, the average marketing year average price of corn noted in red. And obviously, this is getting, if it hasn't reached the peak of the 2012 era, it's getting pretty darn close to it. The other thing that we have here is the blue line, the value of ground. as you note, the value of ground, the value of land it's a little bit lagged from where current prices might be. But obviously there's been a strong run up, and we've had several reports in the last few weeks coming into us here at the university on record setting prices in the state. Neighboring states as well, Iowa, parts of Missouri, some of those things. So the value of what we do, just not the prices of what we're raising, but also the profitability, the cost. And we talked about some of the big three: seed, fertilizer, chemicals, and also energy.
And in the end, coming into play now, more and more interest rates. Crazy. Jim's going to talk about that in a second.
Yeah, and I'll beat me to it. The cost of borrowing, if you're going out to make a purchase, whether for inputs, land, some of these things, when it comes to it, what we see here, we have two things. The red line here I'm using is a 10-year treasury yield note, and I'm not suggesting that we finance land at 4% right now. What it does suggest is it's an indicator of long-term expenses associated with cost of borrowing for the United States. We started last time we had inflation as high as we did, we set some record rates for the treasury bill rate. With that being said, we're also starting to see monetary policy moving interest rates higher to abate the issues that we're having with inflation. And some of the places I look at, the last time I checked a 30-year ag land note on the one website I look at, I think it was at 8.13% for 30 years, which is much more competitive than it was in the 70s, but obviously that starts to add in. Also having reports for the cost of financing of inputs, lines of credit, I've heard anything from 9.25% to 10.5%. That's starting to add up. Even at 5%, it adds up, but 10%. So some of those costs are starting to catch up with where some of the prices are at. Where do I think land's headed? Well, once again, the profitability and the cost of borrowing. We're still seeing some very high price sales coming in, but it also seems to me some of the marginal stuff is simmering a little bit less. It's not boiling over like the higher end sales are.
And my other observation on that is that some of these higher price sales are it's not money being borrowed. It's all money that's cash on hand. And so as long as you're not borrowing, then you don't have to worry about interest rates. I mean, there's that too.
Or a very sizable down payment.
Of course.
Yeah. So, okay. With this, so I think the next two questions are for Al, and then if anybody has any, we'll just review them as they come in.
Okay. If I'm going to terminate a lease. Okay. So you can terminate a lease. If you're going to terminate a lease, the typical time to do that, especially if you're doing a verbal lease or a handshake agreement, is before September 1st. So in other words, the lease year goes from March 1st to February 28th or February 29th. And so in Nebraska, the Supreme Court has ruled that the lease for a farm ground has to be terminated by 6 months prior to March 1st, which is by September 1st. So first of all, you got from now until September 1st, August 31st, actually, to get a letter out if you're going to terminate a lease. You would via certified mail, so that you have a written receipt saying that they've received, the other party has received a letter. I would make sure that it's dated. I would list the name and addresses of the landlord and the tenant. I would give a legal description of the property, at least at some level, so there's no ambiguity about where that property's at. And I would also talk about that the lease is terminating. I get this sent sometime in the middle of August, so they receive it well before September 1st. And then it's terminating on February 28th. This would be 2024, because it's too late to terminate a 23 lease. And legally, I mean, listen, whatever the tenant and the landlord agree to is fine. If they agree verbally or agrees that they could go ahead and terminate the lease for 23, that's fine. But if the tenant wants to farm it, he has a lease for 23, by the way. So, and then, and if you need to have an attorney review this, and they could even send it out for you for a very nominal fee. It's not very expensive to have an attorney prepare this letter and send it for you. Don't ask Jim or I to do it, because universities ask us not to do legal work, because we're not lawyers. And so we can't do that for you necessarily, to say, yes, it's a good letter, and then have something blow up on you and you come back towards us. That would look bad. We're not going to do that. But here's some things that you would include in a letter.
And the written lease, what he described relates to verbal leases. On a written lease, the termination provisions are whatever is stated in the lease. And if there's nothing stated in the lease about the termination, the lease is over when the period is over. More likely than not, many people, they have a mutual agreement that they're just going to keep using that lease forward unless something major happens. And if somebody doesn't want to farm your ground, for the majority of the state, as competitive as things are, you can probably still find a tenant right now. A lot of the things right now, tenants want to know if they're going to have the ground next year, because they have to start figuring out what is that regimen, what are the things I need for seed, fertilizer, chemicals, what am I prepaying before the first year, after the first year, whatever.
There's a lot of tax management strategies that go into this too. And so, in many cases, the tenants already purchased inputs for 2023. So just know that too.
Or at least the discussions are probably occurring right
Right,
now.
right. And all the discounts from your suppliers are coming right now. Okay, if the ground is sold and the current lease ends in February 29, 24, does notification need to be given to the tenant on lease termination? Yeah, as a courtesy, you should tell them. But if there's a written lease and it says the lease is over to February 29, 2024, then it should be done. However, you have to make sure that if it's a written lease, it also doesn't not have a rollover clause that can be implemented. And what's the language in the lease that talks about termination? And so the main thing is just make sure you pay attention to this, make sure you're on top of this. And the questions that come into me are, I am the current tenant. They have not let me know. This just came in like 3 weeks ago. I should have put it in the question pool. A tenant called me or contacted me, said, I'm the current tenant. I have the lease. I'm planning on the lease for 2023, but some other parties that I'm working with don't want me to have the lease. But we have a handshake or verbal agreement. Can they kick me off? I said, no. And any lawyer would be happy to argue that for you. That's a kind of an open and shut deal. You have the lease for 2023 if you want to have it. So just know that it's a professional courtesy, let them know. Just make sure you check your lease. So if it's a written lease, that the termination things are clear, and that if there's a notice to terminate, you make sure that you follow that notification to terminate.
This is another reason why, if you're dealing with an older individual, age gets after them, they pass away, and you have to sell the ground. This is one reason Allan and I advocate for 1-year leases, not multi-year leases, because if you signed a 5-year lease this fall and the ground gets sold next year, unless the new owner and the current tenant mutually agree to terminate the lease, the tenant gets that property for whatever term of the lease it is. We are not against long-term relationships. That's a good thing, especially you work mutually on improving the ground over time. What we don't like is 5-year leases where we're trying to set our cash rents based on $6.50 corn or something. I can guarantee you probably in the next 5 years, corn's probably going to be lower than $6.50, at least at one point, right? And a lot of these things, it's just a lot of unknown. And that's why if you do a multi-year lease, 5-year, whatever it is, at least have a provision in there where you can renegotiate the cash rent up or down. I mean, people don't hear that downside, but you reaccount for differences in yield, expenses, whatever.
Us landlords don't like to hear that downside.
Okay. Okay, so I think let's see if we got any questions coming in. Okay, I have not seen any questions on our end from what we can tell. If you're joining us online still, if you have any questions you'd like us to review, you can either type them into the chat or the Q&A pane. And also, Ryan Evans, our media specialist, gave links to the webinars in the chat pane for that policy webinar that Brad Lubin gave with the University of Missouri. And also, if you want to take a look at our webinars just in general, our Thursday webinars are from 12 to 1. Wide variety of topic throughout the year. Some of them are on some of a kind of a scheduled deal where we try to give an update on our land values and cash rent survey. Glennis McClure on third floor here in Philly Hall also gives updates on the custom rates, as well as some of the work related to the crop budgets. I imagine the crop budgets for 2023 are probably getting pretty darn close to being done. I would imagine she might be giving a webinar here at some point in November, December, or January on those. A lot of different topics evolving, a lot of different things to be keeping in mind. I'm trying to think, is there anything else that comes to mind related to land management, Al? If we don't have any questions coming in that.
Well, I'm just shocked that we have 60 people on today and we don't have, we don't have any questions coming in at all. Here's one. What's a typical move on cash rent per year? 5 or 10%? Well, that depends on where you're at. I mean, it could be 50% if you're at $100 an acre and you got irrigated ground. I mean, it could be 200%. I mean, it kind of depends on where you're starting from. If you're already started at $340 or $400 an acre, then maybe it's zero, or maybe it's a -5 or 10%.
Well,
I mean, it kind of depends on where you
and
start from.
Yeah, so on the topic on the percent change from year to year, if you're in Western Nebraska giving $10 an acre and you go to $12 an acre, that's a 20% increase. Versus if you're in Platte County, Nebraska, paying 300 and whatever an acre, a 20% increase is quite different. I would say if you truly have a cash rent that is being adjusted from year to year, you don't see those huge swings. And when I say adjusted, some people think it only gets adjusted this way. They're truly, if you're accounting for differences in some of these things we've mentioned today, you have the upside as well as downside potential. Percent wise, it's hard to say, but to see gradual changes over time, I'd say are more healthy to see than having these huge fluctuations.
We're not trying to blow that question apart, but you're setting us up for failure by asking it that way. I mean, we can't answer that very well. The other thing I would point out is that what we don't know is happening, and we haven't mentioned it yet this time, is if this drought continues as severely it is at this moment, what's going to happen with all our irrigation districts and what happens to our water allocation in some of these districts. And so we have to be really careful about that too. If you don't have a water allocation, you don't know what you're missing out on. You don't know how lucky you got it. Check the Q&A.
And that'd be something for this upcoming year, a great provision to address, where I've been made aware there's several water districts, while the restrictions aren't very severe yet, some of them are implementing some different regulations or requirements that they haven't ever had before. So how do you account in an irrigated lease if you usually put on whatever number of inches and they cut you back to 2/3 of that? Does the cash rent get adjusted for that? I'm not saying it should or shouldn't. What I'm saying is you need to talk about that now.
Yeah, have those conversations before something goes to heck in a handbasket. Oh, okay. You've mentioned some other webinars, but who's responsible for Eastern Red Cedar control on pasture leases, the owner or the person leasing? Well, Jim will joke that it's always the other party. I mean, if you're the landlord, it's always somebody else. If it's a landlord, then a tenant should take care of it. So tenant's a landlord should take care of it. I've been pretty clear when I've talked that if you have a pasture, the noxious weeds and weed control is a tenant's issue. And if you have a pasture, the trees, Eastern Red Cedar, locust, Russian olive, whatever is your calamity, your malady, that's on the landlord. And just remember for Eastern Red Cedar that if you get them at 3 foot or less, you're a whole lot better off than waiting until they're 10 foot tall. This is a lot cheaper.
So first of all, how bad are the trees? Do you have one cedar tree per acre that you just nip off you jump off the 4-wheeler and cut it off? That's not that bad. Now, do you have 100 per acre? Does the tenant have the type of equipment you need to deal with shredding or shearing or whatever? If they do, what's the best way to get them to go out there and do that? Can you incentivize them? Can you cut the cash rent down in a third or a half or whatever it takes if you really have bad issues? If you have an 80-acre parcel and it looks like a forest, maybe you work with a tenant, you give a much more competitive cash rent, maybe that's not so high, and maybe you say, okay, we're going to deal with the first fourth this year and then do a 3 or 4 year rotation and divide that up. And with it going forward, after it's completely been addressed and the property is clean, going forward, maybe the tenant's responsible for it then.
If I had an 80 acres and it was full of Eastern Red Cedar trees, I'd probably just hire an airplane and get it taken care of. I mean, maybe at least whatever you could afford that year. You got to get after those Eastern Red Cedar because they will make the pasture worthless and not very long if you're not careful.
If you get it to them when they're small, we have on our farm, we have this little flip out saw thing. And if you're not using it, it folds back in. It takes like a second to literally jump off and just cut it off. It's nothing when they're this tall. Well, when they start growing bigger and bigger, and then you got to use a chainsaw or whatever, and then you got this big thing laying out there too. Why do you deal with that, or how do you deal with that? And there are a lot of places across the state that have the type of equipment, typically charged by the hour. These big shredder things that can go on the front of a skid steer. There's shears. There's just different ways to deal with it. The time of the year you do that kind of stuff is this time when it's dry. I guess fire risk is a little bit of a concern, but this is a time before it starts snowing a ton. You get out there and the vegetation's dead.
And the thing with Eastern red cedar controls, if you get them at the ground with no little branches coming, they're gone. If you, whereas if you're doing an elm tree or a cedar, an elm tree or a locust or something like that, you need to do some treatment. Let's look at the Q&A, Jim. See what we got up there. I think we got a couple there, maybe.
All right.
How would erosion be resolved? What would the cost be to resolve? Would be shared between landlord and tenant or with crop share agreement? Well, no, if it's minor erosion, the tenant should just take care of it. It's more major erosion. If you have to reshape a field or something like that, that's a landowner expense. That's kind of what I've done on my farm in eastern Nebraska. Sorry about that, landlord, but there's no share. The landlord needs to take care of it. Now, there's other arrangements where the landlord has the tenant take care of it, and then he pays him for that operation, or he discounts his rent for the next year for that operation. You can come up with a equitable solution to that if you just talk to each other.
My other comment is if you have severe dirt work that needs to get done, you get a dozer out or a scraper excavator, there may be, and I don't know if there is or isn't, but I would also check with my local farm service agency or at
NRCS.
Natural Resource Conservation Service, and see if there's some type of cost share where they can help you get some buffer strips established or whatever.
There has been some EQIP money. This environmental, whatever it stands for, EQIP. There have been some EQIP money to do this sort of work. So check with NRCS for that. Go to your local FSA office and ask for the NRCS people.
All right. So next question I'll take. The question basically states, okay, we have the USDA survey with the cash rent results that were presented in prior land management quarterly webinars. We've also done presentations from some of the UNL work. There's a difference between the surveys. As I would expect, they're independent surveys. Who does the USDA survey? They survey operators. Who does the University of Nebraska survey? People that work in the land industry. Is one survey more right or wrong than the other one? What I tell people is they're both estimates. Without estimates, all we have is coffee shop talk, as Al calls it. And that obviously, who knows what it comes to. What I would tell people is they're both sources of information. They're no more right or wrong compared to the other one. The thing that really matters is, what do you have? What do you intend to rent? What do you want to rent to someone? What's the honest assessment? Do you have a pasture with trees, and do you have ground here north of town? There's certain areas in Saunders County where it looks like there's almost a ravine in the field because it started eroding so badly. What do you have and how do you deal with it? And this year I've seen a wide variety of crop yields as well. Some areas were blessed enough to get some degree of rainfall and they at least had some corn. Other areas you're talking 30 bushel an acre because it was so dry. You truly got to account for that. And remember, both of these numbers are averages. To make an average, there is numbers below it and there are clearly numbers above it. And that's why you got to account for those differences.
I think sometimes the farmers fill out their NAS survey knowing that they get a sweetheart deal from relatives, that sort of thing. And that tends to skew that a little bit down a little bit. I'm not saying it's wrong. Here's what I would do with those surveys. I would look from year to year to year to kind of see where the trend is going. That's the major help to us in terms of how I look at that sort of information.
The other comment I have is the survey period. The University of Nebraska Lincoln does their survey a little bit earlier. The USDA does their survey a little bit later. I've always joked with Al, I really don't know when people set cash rents because we get calls almost every day of the year if we'd answer our phone. Now they are cyclical. There are periods where there's more cash rent questions coming in, but I do think there are people that don't have the cash rent even if the seed is in the ground or currently growing. It might vary based on the factors of the year, especially on dry land.
It's amazing how the calls seem to trickle in all year round rather than just when we're ready to terminate the lease or when we're ready right before March 1st. In August and right before March 1st is when we get the bulk of the calls, but they will trickle in all year round, i.e. the call I got today even. So, and I'm not being critical of any of the calls. We're happy to take them, but it's just interesting how that works.
Okay. So with that, the question came in. What are you spraying cedar trees with? My comment on that's a great question to call your local crops or the beef educator, the ag agents across the state, some people might call them. They're the local people. They are the best ones to know. The University of Nebraska Lincoln has a pesticide application manual that can give you different ratings on different products. And
EC 130, Extension Circular 130 is that manual that Jim's just referring to. And that's what your crop or beef educator will handle. So call your local extension office to get the answer to that. It can be looked up fairly quickly.
mechanical or chemical is about the two ways to deal with it. All right.
Well, you can go fire on cedar trees, but I wouldn't this year because it's just too darn dry.
Yeah. All right. We got a few more minutes left. Oh, I forgot. Okay. We got a few more minutes left, so we'll wrap everything up here. Once again, we want to thank Hertz Farm Management out of Norfolk. We really appreciate them for helping sponsor today's meeting. Once again, if you need anything related to management, sales, whatever, please contact Scott, David, or Jason. And thank you once again for helping us out with the webinar. And the other thing is, with our annual survey on land values and cash rents, mailing costs are going up after the first of the year again. If you have any interest in helping support some of the things that Allan and I have worked on related to the information featured from the report, please consider any type of a donation, whatever it's free and open. And as long as I'm around, it should stay free and open to the public. It's just, once again, the actual survey is sending it out to everyone across the state has risen. And if you'd like to reach out, there's a website you can go to, or contact Barbara at the University of Nebraska Foundation, and she can work with you too on that if you'd like to make anything helps us. So we greatly appreciate them over at the University Foundation.
Chat.
Oh
yeah, do this quick, yeah.
Final thing here, we have a series of meetings coming up. They're kind of our traditional landlord-tenant cash rent meetings. I have noted on here, we have some scheduled in December, January, and into February. And my guess is we might even have some in late February into March. But the ones we currently have scheduled are listed here.
I think that cap.unl.edu website should be followed by land management, not succession. Does that sound right? It's on both places. Okay, very good. Outstanding.
So just find the CAP website. You should be able to find it there. The only thing you got to do is call the local extension office to let them know you're coming. It's not an obligation, but we need to get head counts, especially in the places where we're going to be having a lunch.
Notice that we have some coming up in January. Holdridge, Hastings, O'Neill, January 4, 5, 6, and then Beatrice and Hardington. And then we got a couple in February too. February 1, February 20. February 1 in Lancaster will be recorded. Yes. Correct. And that'll be on the website after sometime, a couple weeks after that. We'll have that up on the website. So if you miss one of the meetings in person, you can always get to what we have to say by watching that Lancaster County recording when we do that on February 1st. Chat.
Oh, and finally, Monday, February 13th is our next land management quarterly for 2023. You're taking a review, looking at cash rental rates for 22 into 23. Also taking a look at how do we figure out a cash rental rate? How do you calculate it? Allan has some considerations for leases. And once again, if you got questions, you want an actual slide made on it, other than us just rambling on what we think. If we have an hour or two to prepare for these questions, we can try to find you articles or insight that are much more tailored. So with that,
there it is, Guide for Weed Management.
Ryan also sent out links to the group on the weed guide, as well as if you would like to make a donation. There have been donations made throughout the year, and that greatly helps us with our printing. Printing and postage always makes this survey an expensive proposition. But with that,
thanks for being on. We appreciate you listening in.
Yes. So with that, please remember to join us. And once again, I know there's a little confusion with the registration email on the link you had to click. We'll try to streamline that again next. So thank you all.
Chat.